Hey everyone, how's it going?
Hey, Matt.
Hey man, I was slightly delayed there because I was unmuting everybody's mic at the time, trying to figure that out. But yeah, hey everybody in the audience, and hello to Guy. So welcome to the show today, Guy.
Howdy,
So
thanks for having me.
yeah, so where's everybody in the audience from? We got Volton here saying hello to us. All of us at the moment are in Melbourne. And it has been an incredibly rainy couple of weeks in Melbourne. Actually, are you in Melbourne at the moment, Aaron? You are? Yeah, you were
I will.
yesterday.
I will be for the next 24 hours.
Yep.
Then I'm out again.
So yeah, it has been some cold and wet weather, which has been interesting for us. But yeah, good to get together again. And we got Long Beach, so we got some international guests coming along today, which is really good to see. So we know, and we've spoken about many times, that Matt and I have, maybe Aaron, maybe not as much as us, but we have some affinity to Python. All of us here have an affinity to CDK and what that brings, and how much easier it is for CloudFormation, and how much along the lines of engineering that is. Today we've got Guy that will be taking us through a HA well-defined architecture of deploying a WordPress site using CDK. So, like Guy will go into a bit more, but there's a lot of details and numbers around how many websites on the internet are actually run by WordPress. And we've all used, various hosting mechanisms at some point in time. Probably we've touched WordPress at some point in time, right? And when you think about some of the sites that are being run by WordPress, there can be some big ones out there, and so you do need some ways to manage that in a more a more productionized environment. So I think that this is going to be a good intro to that. But
one thing to jump on, Paul, actually, is I'm just looking at an old blog. It's 2017, and it's 80% of the internet. I was actually surprised it's still such a huge number. I was thinking like 50% now. But they still reckon back in 2017, 5 years ago, 80% of the internet was powered by PHP, and the majority of that PHP was WordPress, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
I think that was. Yeah. We were sort of talking about some of those numbers before, and Guy was sort of mentioning that those numbers are still really high at the moment, and it's important to be able to do that or have the ability to manage that in a mechanism that's a little bit more automated and a bit, we feel a bit better about that. So we've done deploying WordPress on what's it called? What's the way?
Lightsail, yeah.
Lightsail.
But we've done
Lightsail,
Beanstalk
right?
before as well together.
I was going to say, Beanstalk used to be used a lot to do WordPress.
Yep. And Lightsail has been great for our blog, right? Like, we don't have a huge amount of traffic. It's been really great. It's been easy to access for us. It's build and set up separately, and we've got a load balance in front of us managing all this stuff for us and the backups and so forth. But we know that we're using it at a scale that is very appropriate for something like Lightscale.
But so, one of the things I love about Lightsail, though, is I know exactly how much it's going to cost me a month, right? So usually when you're in AWS land, we've got to add up the infrastructure, like on top of the costs of like the EC2 instances. And if we have auto scaling and all this HA, costs can go up from what we expect sometimes, or it could be lower. Whereas like, I think of my old PHP like hosting providers, like way back when I was a teenager, and it was like $5 a month. Here you go. So that's kind of why we've kept everything on Lightsail, because we know what we're spending. It's not going to scale if we have huge amounts of traffic headed up, but like we know that it's not going to hit up our credit card, and Paul's going to have to go to his manager and say, hey, I need some money for this.
Yep. I we've got comments about like good old PHP and 80% of the internet running on PHP. I mean, we've done it many times, like hosting from home, using a Raspberry Pi, all this sorts of stuff. Like I hosted tons of my sites at home over the years, and it's kind of fun to do that. And you can do that, if it's like, the performance isn't required. So, it's a good thing. Now,
and I think the interesting.
I was going to say that
No, that's all right. I was just going to say one of the interesting things about the origins, I guess, of this is that it does come from that early days of the internet, like when you would hire a virtual private server and you'd have a single Linux box and everything had to go on that, you know. So some of that simplicity is why it's designed the way it is, and it still works today too, you know.
And you scratch from control panel to like now I have full control of my VPS because I'm doing all this custom stuff with these plugins. Like it was fun days actually because you kind of like you could go in with like a low, like I just want to write a blog, and then you could learn a little bit about like what's happening in cPanel, and then you're like, what's this Apache thing? And then you end up like going in and going underneath the hood, and suddenly you're dealing with VPS. So like it was kind of like choose how comfortable you are with those providers. I love those days. Yeah.
I've never been a fan of PHP, right? Like just not a fan of it. But I love WordPress. I do actually love WordPress. I think for like very simple content management and getting a website up and running, especially like through the auto deploy way of doing things, like WordPress as a SaaS or whatever you call it. But I think it's simplified web development for so many people. So many organizations, like large enterprises, actually use WordPress for their front end, you know, for the advertising their business and stuff. I've had to learn a little bit of PHP to work with it, and that's why I hate it. But otherwise, no, I think WordPress is awesome. It's amazing.
Hey, if it gets the job done, that's good enough, right? Like I know so many programmer friends that like do PHP day to day because there's so much that needs to be maintained, and businesses grow from very small startups on WordPress and they scale out. So if you learn WordPress and PHP, you know, the money's good. The language has gotten a lot prettier, like over the years as well. Like I think PHP 7 onwards is a lot prettier than when I used to use it in PHP 5.4 days, I think it was. Yeah.
I think it's the content management side of it, right? It's made easy. I've been in projects where we've built content managers. I've worked with like other enterprise content management systems that, you know, you pay a lot for, but at the end of the day, it's made simple by PHP on Raspberry Pi. Yeah, why not?
So we're going to force you out of your comfort zone, Aaron, I think.
So, I like Mate's idea.
Let me just clarify one thing. I was just going to say, I actually love Python. I just don't like Python in the web. So I am a big Python fan for where it's useful, not in the web.
Well, you'll come see, like a couple of years down the track with PyScript as we go forward. But Voltlon says, you know, the server-side processing versus client-side processing. And I think that's a really good call out. Like, of course, you can use PHP to build out your JSON response objects and send it back and use it as an API and have React at the front end. But one of the beautiful things that comes with WordPress is its ability to define your SEO. Like this is what's like really important around that. Like server-side rendering is easy when you're using WordPress because you have server-side rendering. The bots that are going through and working out what is happening on your website. Why not use Node? You can do that for sure. But it's much more costly in terms of your time to set that up. We've been through a number of times working that out with anyone, right? Any one of those server-side languages. An MVC app that renders on the server is something that's there, and you know a lot of this is made really easy with WordPress. There's a number of plugins to help manage SEO and pretty URLs and all this sort of stuff. So you know it's a consideration, and you know you've got to build and use the tool that's appropriate to what you're building.
Easier thumbnail generation, right? But I'm going to put my foot down. I'm going to say like when we talked about PHP, like Firefix said, you know, please don't WordPress. It's like, well, you know what? Businesses run WordPress. It's completely fine. And there's money in supporting those businesses as programmers. And that's what it comes down to, right? That's the same. You come to a shop and they're using Microsoft and, you know, you go into C# land. You might be doing data analytics. You're going to use Python. You just, whatever's
that's the right tool for the job, right?
The right tool for the job, and the right tool to support the customer grow.
That was all my point was around Python. It's the right tool for the job.
But the beautiful white space gets you. You will convert, Aaron.
No, so I do love Python syntax. Absolutely. It's just it's not always the right tool for the job. I won't list out the right tools. I mean the right jobs.
It's the second best tool for every job.
Before we hand over completely to Guy and we start going into WordPress and stuff, there was one specific announcement that we thought was worthy of mention this week, I'll bring that up. That is DynamoDB's data import directly from S3. So we thought this was an interesting piece to bring up because whenever you're doing a migration or building something new, and you need to pre-populate your database, usually the way that happens is, like if it's, let's just say it's SQL Server or MySQL, you can do an import directly from CSV and you've got a mechanism to move it across. When it's DynamoDB, that can be harder. You've usually got to write some code or some shell scripting around using the API to do some data loads or something like that. This is a good way that you can say, use your CSV file or DynamoDB JSON objects or Amazon Ion format, drop that into a bucket, configure it up properly and set up your mappings, and bang, it'll import like massive amounts of that data into your DynamoDB table. Now, if you were doing a migration that, I don't know, let's just pick a random figure that had 1 billion rows, you could write your export package from your original database and put that into a CSV file, but you'd have to open that CSV file and read through it, loop through it, write a code to do it. It'd take a really long time. You've got to manage that. What happens with your code? How long is your Lambda function running, or what sort of compute is doing that behind that? Dropping into an S3 bucket is a really good way to basically say, pick that up and we'll take care of the processing for you. So I thought that was worth mentioning. And somebody
I've just dropped,
Aaron's.
the Ion docs. So just to build on top of that, so Ion is a superset of JSON. So you can take a JSON document, you can add additional Ion, attributes to it. Obviously, it's a superset, so it's not backwards compatible. You can't use an Ion doc as a JSON doc, but you can use a JSON doc as an Ion doc. But that's just another one of the 3 formats that you can use for doing the bulk import onto DynamoDB.
Yep. So now, given all of that discussion, we'll hand directly over to you, Guy. Did you want to give an intro a little bit about yourself and why you came up with this, and let us know when we bring up your screen?
Sure. Cool. So I've been, so my name's Guy, as you know. I've been sort of working in the internet since the mid-90s. So I sort of got in sort of as soon as I could. Certainly used WordPress and have built a lot of, spent quite a bit of my career as a full stack developer as well, building solutions, including with things like Perl as well. So we haven't talked about Perl today, but Perl before PHP existed. So I've done a lot of. Aaron's shaking his head.
Hey, it was all GeoCities until WordPress, right?
So
exactly.
I wrote a vending machine in Perl. Fine, it's a language. I will admit it is a language.
So I really just to digress. The thing I like about Perl is it has such a nice philosophy. It's got a lot of sort of thought gone into it, but I don't use it anymore. But not because I hate it, but just because it's kind of its time has passed to a large degree. And if I was doing sysadmin, I'd probably use Perl still, but because I'm not, other things. So app developer, background, and been working in AWS since about 2015. Pretty much full-time moving things into AWS, and seen a lot of the sort of the expansion of the possibilities that's brought. My wife still works in marketing and touches WordPress quite a lot, so I run some WordPress sites for my own sort of vanity projects, so I've got a fair bit of investment in it. So and it's one of those problems that customers keep coming to me and saying, I'm running this WordPress site, what can I do with it? And it's always frustrating to sort of not have an answer that you kind of thought through. So anyway, so this is just my crack at, it's not the only way of doing it. It's one way of doing it. I'm sure there's improvements could be made, like everything. Maybe there's things I've missed, etc. It might not suit your use case, but it's presented as a here's an idea of how you might do it, and just showing how to do it in CDK is sort of the plan for today. If I could just grab the slides, that'd be really cool. Yep, that's the ones. So we touched on already. WordPress has a very long history. So it's 2003, so it's almost 20 years that it's been kicking around, right? So it was designed in that pre-cloud world where everything was designed to be installed on the one box. The classic WordPress installation has a MySQL database installed on it. It has Apache. It's the classic LAMP stack application. And so it was designed to work in that environment, and it does those things really well. So 43% of websites today still run on WordPress, which is, a mind-boggling number when you think about it. For an open source project, it's had a huge amount of longevity. It's had a few challenges along the way that never really quite have ever, cracked it, knocked it off its perch. And it's, in part that's because it is easy to use and people find it sort of easy to kind of, get started with it. So it's got a lot of good design elements. It's got a lot of bad design elements as well. So some of the challenges, because it was initially designed the way it is to be all on the one box, you can log into the WordPress admin panel and you can upload files directly into that server environment through the web. Now, anyone who's sort of done internet security for any period of time will just, the flashing lights will be going off and they'll be going, oh my God, you can't possibly be serious. Like, what are you talking about? And it's not only that you can, upload static things like media and images and CSS files, you can upload code, right? Yep. So you can upload plugins, you can install plugins, themes and plugins all have code that can be executed, and that's a nightmare from a security point of view. It creates a lot of problems, and there's been a lot of exploits, throughout the years where WordPress sites have become, parts of botnets because there's been plugins that have been malicious and done nasty things. So there's some challenges around how it's put together as well. But so, when I sort of approached this problem, I didn't want, some solutions really make you suffer to keep some of the good things, or to make WordPress kind of work in the cloud and work with high availability. They kind of chop WordPress off at the knees with a lot of different strategies. So for instance, building it out as a static site. So there's plugins where you can basically export your WordPress site as a set of static pages. That's a perfectly good strategy. It's just not the strategy I want, because it's an extra step that, a lot of users who like the way WordPress works, they just want to be able to go click, upload an image, change a page, publish, it's done. Some strategies are, to take snapshots essentially. So you publish a version of your site that can't be on an immutable server. So you have a point in time that you can then replicate. And that's, again, another perfectly reasonable strategy if it works for you. But what I wanted to try and do was preserve that ease of use of having it, you can log into the console, make a change to the page that's published immediately without, and still have it to be highly available and to have some sort of confidence that it was secure and performant as well. So those are the sorts of design goals that I have for it. So I'll just go through a quick sort of diagram of what we're going to look at in terms of how it's being built. And feel free to stop me and ask any questions along the way too. I don't want to feel like I'm just blurbing this out at you. If there's any questions or anything.
I already like the approach, Guy. I was thinking, like security, and I'm like, oh man, the biggest problem with WordPress to me was it was so widely adopted, it became an easy target for a SQL injection and everything else, right? And so I'm like, I don't know how you're going to do that, because basically you just need to constantly make sure it's up to date to be well protected. But already liking the fact that you've got Shield on the front and WAF. So nice. Yep. I wouldn't.
And there's that common URL like /wp admin, right? You're just going to see that on any site that you put on the internet. If you look through the logs or the trial access logs, someone somewhere is going to try and do /wp admin on your web application.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's lots and lots of strategies too for helping to ameliorate those sorts of risks. So, for instance, you can't, and there's lots of things that I haven't done on this because I've just put the sort of basic architecture together. But there's things like you can change the location of WP admin. You can change the location of the WP login page. So these are things that should also be done. I'm not going to demonstrate having done all those things because that's kind of not what I'm focused on here. But I think with WordPress, you've got to take and we talk about this in AWS too, of multi-level security. So you want to have you want to introduce security at every layer if you can. So where there's an opportunity to improve security, do it everywhere. So Shield. So that's out of the box. You've got Shield with AWS. I'm using Web Application Firewall. So Amazon has some nice managed rules. So AWS managed rules specifically for WordPress. So those are worth sort of adopting. There's also some good managed rules around things like IP reputation, known bad traffic. So out of the box, there's a lot of stuff you can kind of introduce right at that WAF, right at the front door. That's worth doing. Obviously, CloudFront provides some security as well in the sense that you can terminate your SSL sessions there, your TLS sessions on CloudFront. And also, of course, you've got the fact that you're exposing your site at the edge network rather than just bringing all your traffic back to your instances, which are potentially much harder to protect. You've got taking advantage of the fact that you've got this cloud network. So you can see here that a lot of traffic is going to end up being served by CloudFront, like a typical site that's got a lot of relatively static content that you've just put together. A lot of that content will be 100% served by CloudFront and will never even reach your back end. But when we do have origin requests, let's just have a look at what we've got there. So we've got an application load balancer, and so we're passing through HTTPS through there. So we've got encryption through to the ALB. I always like to draw these ALBs like this because ALBs actually, they're in each of the subnets that you deploy it to. There's actually an ALB node in each of those things. I like to sort of point that out because it wasn't clear to me first time I started using ALB. It was like, is it just a sort of a magical service that just magically sort of lives everywhere? And it's not. Well, it is magical. It's great, but it's not magical. If you like.
And in this instance, we've got Certificate Manager, and your TLS offloading is happening at the application load balancer, and that's all being handled for you.
That's right, exactly. And I've got a certificate on the ALB as well, and we're passing through HTTPS through to that as well from CloudFront. So that's encrypted there as well. And on the application load balancer, I'm using rules. So one of the great things about application load balancer is the rules engine. You can do a lot of really useful stuff. And so what I've done here is I've elected to essentially use my load balancer it does two things. One, it checks that all the traffic's coming from CloudFront. So it doesn't accept traffic unless it's coming from CloudFront. And the second thing is, and I'm using the CloudFront prefix lists in my security groups for ALB. So that's an easy way now. You can kind of allow traffic in from CloudFront. That's only relatively, I think, when did we get those? I think it was a year or so ago, maybe a little bit more. But they're a really useful feature. And the rules in the ALB will either pass traffic through to two different auto-scaling groups. So you can see here I've got a one that's marked as an allow list. So the allowed traffic will come through to an admin auto-scaling group of EC2 instances. So that admin set of instances will only receive traffic from this allowed list. So in my case, I've just said, okay, well, I've got some IP addresses, some static IP addresses that I'm going to allow admin traffic from, and I'm just going to unless it's from that list, it's going through to the fleet, the fleet instances, the fleet auto-scaling group. So the difference being that the fleet instances only have read-only access to the file system that runs WordPress. So they've got they've got read-write access to the parts of the file system that aren't WordPress. So if they need to write logs and so on, they can still do that. But the actual directory that's running WordPress, they can only mount read-only. And I'm using IAM authentication for the EFS. And again, that's something that's come through. I can't tell you when, but it's a relatively recent, in the last couple of years, addition to EFS. So these EFS targets, they're present in each of these private subnets, and the instances have instance roles with policies in them that give them grant them the relevant access to the file system. And then underneath all that, I've got my Aurora cluster.
Yep.
So Guy, serving as the database. Yeah.
When we have the so somebody might say, like, for the admin instance, why would you have an auto scaling group? And an auto scaling group doesn't just mean that it will auto scale because of like volume of traffic. So let's put it this way: am I likely to ever have so many admins using the admin interface that we need to auto scale the admin? No. The benefit of having the auto scaling group is self-healing.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so
exactly.
You can set that auto scaling group to like 1 and always only have 1 up.
Yep.
But if something went wrong in that instance, or you decided to reboot it or turn it off, another one would come up and set itself back up. So someone might ask that question, why you want to do that, and the difference between like using or why you would use an auto scaling group, even if you only ever wanted to have 1 instance, it still provides the benefit because of that self-healing piece. Whereas the auto scaling group around the fleet instances is there because as those fleets, as traffic comes on and the event goes forward or whatever it happens to be, the traffic builds up, CPU goes high. All right, we'll scale out and we'll put another couple of instances.
To add to that, Paul, like I see that a lot in where people are worried about auto scaling. Like, oh, if I don't want to have too many servers, to your point, right? You've got 2 AZs here, so you would say a maximum of 2 and a minimum of 2, and split them across AZs. So you will only, to Paul's point, you will only ever have 1 instance in each AZ. So if you kill one, it will start another one up in that AZ. But you'll always have the 2 instances across your AZs, so you'll always have something to load balance against. So it's resilient as opposed to just, it's going to scale for usage.
Yep.
Yeah. So yes, in both cases, these auto scaling groups have launch templates associated with them, and those launch templates are the things that map, which AMI am I going to use to run this. And as you say, I mean, what it lets you do is it lets you essentially be resilient in the case of an AZ failure as well. So if I have 1 admin instance in 1 AZ and that AZ fails, and I haven't set it up using an auto scaling group across multiple AZs that's defined to be able to launch instances into multiple AZs. When that AZ goes down, I've got a problem. I can't admin my site until I go and create another admin instance. Whereas with an auto scaling group that's configured to use all of my AZs, I'm golden, right?
Yep.
I'll touch on a little bit more about that golden.
Yeah, and that could be even if you just had 1 instance and that whole AZ went down. Well,
absolutely.
The other AZ will just start up an instance, so you're good to go.
Exactly. Yep. That's exactly right. Exactly. I'll touch on that golden AMI a little bit too. So what so part of what I wanted to do with this project was also build like a WordPress AMI. Now, so touching on what we talked about before, where there's this model of using WordPress where it's all on the one box essentially. So I've built an EC2 image builder image originally with the option to be able to say, I want to install PHP, I want to install WordPress, I want to configure it and configure Apache, and also give me the option to also install a database on that instance, right? Because that's still a valid use case for people who want to just have a single box and they don't want to run RDS and it's just not worth it and all the rest of it. So I built some image builder components for making that, for pipelines for making that, and I also used that to build one for EFS because there's still some things that you don't want to wait for when you're booting up an instance. So when you're booting up an instance to add it to an auto scaling group, you've got your user data script that you can run to configure that instance. But the more stuff you do in that block, the slower it's going to be before it comes online. So if you want your auto-scaling group to be, quite quick to respond to changes in demand, you want to try and offload some of that sort of setup to build that into the AMI before you start. So that's what I've done here too. And finally, I'll just point out Secrets Manager is really cool. When you create a database, a cluster with CDK, and it will automatically create your database secrets as a secret in Secrets Manager. The way I've got this put together, which I'll sort of jump into the code in a sec, the way this is all pulled together is that essentially we build this environment in 5 separate stacks. And the first one being VPC, the second one being the database, the third one being the admin instance, or the admin scaling group. And basically each one of those things picks up information from the previous stack. And in the admin stack, we never actually see the database password or credentials here, because they're automatically just passed from one thing to the next through Secrets Manager. And so I'll just walk through that in a sec. I think that's probably enough of an overview. Does that make sense so far? Anyone? Are we getting any questions or?
No, I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think it's reasonably traditional. Like if you took like one slice of the vertical and just making sure that it's got HA and self-healing, and then got some advanced security concepts on the top.
Yep. Cool. Alrighty. Well, let's switch over to Visual Studio Code.
Can I, while you are switching over, just for the advantage of those watching, can you explain? Like you've just said, you've broken it into 5 stacks. I love that because I do often have people come to me with this giant monolithic CDK app, and they're like, "Hey, I've got this really big app, but it's really hard to manage. What's the advantage of CDK over just doing it in CloudFormation template?" And then I look at their monolithic thing and say, "Well, you're not using stacks. You're not breaking things down." Like, can you talk us through the rationale behind why you've split it into those 5 stacks?
I moved away from free tier, right? Kinda. Yeah.
So for me, the chief reason I love CDK and I prefer it over CloudFormation is that it gives me a mental model of what I'm building, and by dividing it up into stacks, it makes that it by staging it as different stacks, it all kind of like logically things flow together. And to me, as a developer, like I really appreciate when someone writes code that it's understandable. And to me, infrastructure as code should be no different. Like there's nothing worse to me than a big fat CloudFormation template that's just totally opaque, and there's no relationships between things without you kind of, working your way through the spaghetti. So for me, it's as much about logic, like thinking about the parts of the infrastructure logically as anything else. I also really like the idea of making things modular and making things sort of productized. So I'm about to show you the sort of starting point. So one of the things that I find that I've found, and I'm not saying that this is the only way to do it or the best way to do it, but I found a good way of managing parameters in a CDK project, as in the things that you need as inputs to build the stack correctly, is to use a properties file like this. So what I've done here is and again, because WordPress is the kind of thing you might need to do, like if you've got 10 customers, you want to roll out 10 WordPress stacks, right? So you want to be able to say, here's this customer, here's that customer, here's that customer. They're all cookie cutter implementations essentially, but there's a handful of parameters that are going to differ between them. So this is how I do that. And essentially what's happening here is that, so I'm defining a bunch of things that I need, like including my AMI parameter. So that's referring to the parameter store parameter that's going to hold my AMI ID that's come out of EC2 Image Builder. Things like hosted zone IDs and names, et cetera, et cetera. CloudFront prefixes. These vary by region. So you've got a different CloudFront prefix in every region. So you kind of want to know that. And there might be a better way of doing it, but I don't know what it is. So stuff like that.
That's what
I'm sure
I was
there's
going
an
to ask.
SDK call.
Yeah, why are you, say things like your ALB DNS name, right? Why are you declaring that here in the parameters file instead of allowing CDK to go and deploy the ALB and provide it to the parameters?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the reason is because the thing that actually needs that is the CloudFront distribution, and CloudFront distribution is going to be deployed into US East 1. And so therefore it can't access the parameters.
Then that brings me back to my other question, and this might just be the way that you've structured it all, but then why would you have not done that as a shared resource between stacks and then have your CloudFront distribution set up in CDK as well? So it can all be managed. It's just more personal interest, I guess. I mean, personal.
Yeah. Look, I think it's probably partly just this is, that's my one shame, is that I've kind of made this choice. Because I would like to. Look, I have multiple shames, of course, but this is the one I'm going to tell you about today. I would love to know. I would love to find a more elegant way of doing that. But anyway, look. So maybe you can show me some better way of doing it.
Perhaps in a couple of episodes' time, I can demonstrate exactly that.
Cool, that'd be great. And I mean, I know there's some other things like CDK pipelines can let you work across regions and things too. So yeah, but I guess I've sort of probably indexed for simplicity here, But anyway, yes, let's do that. I'd be super interested in that as well. So, just realized that clicking on the screen here won't work. So and then basically what's happening is we're pulling in some context. So I'm using context variables when I call the call the CDK commands to deploy and diff and so forth. I'm using context variables to basically pick the config blob, the stanza that I want to use for this environment. And you can see here I've got a little bit of futzing about, which is basically just creating some. It's creating a host name that is going to be used for the WordPress site, so the site host name, and it's either deriving that, it's either accepting that as an argument for, or as a configuration called subdomain, or it's making one up. So just depending on what's right. Then I've got my VPC stack, I've got my Aurora stack, I've got my admin stack, I've got my fleet stack. And finally, I've got my CDN stack, which I've got a little bit of ugly logic here, just to only call that if I've got a DNS name configured. So again, we'll circle back and come up with a nicer way of doing that. So you can see here too that what I'm doing is, so I've got my VPC stack, and then I'm passing some variables through to my subsequent stacks. So my VPC stack is being referenced by Aurora. Then I've got the Aurora stacks being referenced by my admin stack, and so on and so forth. So that's just a really nice, easy way of essentially managing all the exports from stack A that need to be imported into stack B, and CDK just does all that for you, which is super convenient. Any questions so far?
Where did you have the Elastic file system? Where did you define that?
Yep, I'll show you that. That'll be in the admin stack.
Yep.
So I'll just go through them one by one. So VPC stack, one of the awesome things about CDK is just how easy it makes it to deploy a VPC and create your subnets. So I've created my VPC here. With just the standard sort of CIDR range. I've created my private isolated subnets, my private with NAT ones, and my public ones as per the solution diagram you saw.
Maybe just stop for 1 second there. For anybody that's not super familiar with the difference between that, it would be if you are in public, you have access to the internet. So you deploy an instance in the public, you have access to the internet. If you're in private with NAT,
So
then you have like restricted access to internet that must go via that NAT gateway that's defined. If you're private isolated, it means there is no way for that instance or anything within that subnet to get out to the internet. It is impossible to do any sort of reach out to the internet.
That's right. Exactly. And with the public ones, of course, the other point is that it's the only type where the internet can get to you. So it's got a route. It's got a route to 0000, and that's inbound as well through the internet gateway. Yep.
The other thing that's slightly different on that same kind of like VPC creation is for those that are using existing AWS account, you want to use an existing VPC. In CDK, there's VPC lookup, which allows you to define those originally configured settings on that account. So that's one thing that people always ask me, so I wanted to call it out.
Also,
absolutely.
For the CDK L2 construct for creating a VPC, it will auto-generate for you across two AZs, a public and a private subnet. So if you're just doing the default L2 without actually adding any configuration, you will have a public and a private across two AZs.
Yep. Yeah. So I think that's a good call out that you've done that this way, Guy. Basically saying that there is no ever reason that Aurora instance needs ever access the internet. It never needs to do it.
That's right.
So therefore, the private isolated region is right for you.
Yep, because it's managed by AWS. That's right. The other thing I'll just call out too is the NAT gateways equals 1. So one of the expensive things that can happen if you don't control this is you will get NAT gateways at each of your AZs, and NAT gateways cost about $20 a month, I think, USD. So I've just made the choice here to have 1. If you specify only 1, it'll write route tables for all of your AZs to route through that one NAT gateway. But if obviously it's not resilient, so if you've only got 1, then one AZ goes down that happens to be the one with your NAT gateway in it, then you've lost NAT. But for my purposes, this was okay. But if you were doing this on production deployment, you'd probably want to do 2 or 3. So match it up to the number of AZs you're using. So you can see here I've created some my flow logs, configured flow logs. I've also created all my security groups here, and then they're just passed along. So you can see when I've gone self-dot, that means I'm creating a property on this object here that then gets carried down through the other stacks. So creating all my security groups, limiting all my ingress rules, egress rules, or controlling both. A list of allowed IPs that I had in my properties file. So this is where I'm creating my inbound permissions. So you can see I'm actually allowing this on the ALB so that I can directly access the ALB, but only from permitted IPs as well as from CloudFront. And here's my CloudFront prefix for the ALB as well. I've also got systems manager permissions. So I've got an interface feed VPC endpoint for SSM set up here as well. So that so there's actually 3 of them: SSM, EC2 messages, and SSM messages. So all of those mean that I can allow. So I don't have to allow any outbound from my EC2 instances either, because the systems manager, session manager, can talk to these instances via the VPC endpoint. Does that sort of clear, or have I gone a bit deep and nerdy there on that?
No, I think that's clear. I was just answering some of the questions that were coming up here. Right.
So. I was going to say deep and nerdy is what we want, right? We're all devs.
Yeah,
we all want deep and nerdy.
Cool. So just a quick call out to how awesome Session Manager is, and if you're not using Session Manager, you really ought to be, because it just makes accessing your instances super easy.
Yeah, there's a question here that says, so how about downscaling? What could be simplified about all of this for small businesses with restricted budgets without sacrificing safety? I know my answer is there's a sliding scale of what risk you're willing to accept versus the cost, right?
From from the diagram, I would say this is the bare minimum, right? Because you've got only 2 AZs, so you've got your resiliency. If you sacrifice 1 AZ and you just have it all running in one, you've got no resiliency. So, but you've got one, you've specified 1 NAT here. So there is, if 1 AZ did go down, you lose your NAT AZ, you've got nothing. But if you lost your other AZ, you've still got resiliency. And then you've only got one instance in each AZ for all of your instance types, but like remembering back to the diagram, this I would suggest to that question is like, this is your bare minimum.
I would argue you could combine like admin with the customer portal, right? Like if you wanted to kind of like scale it right down, like you could combine those 2 elements, those 2 EC2s, or you could start to think about like sizing your EC2s so that like, if there's not that much load, but you need high availability, you could look at using Graviton ARM type instances that are really small. And then, you'll watch the dashboard as things scale up, and then you might go and bump up instance types because you're making money through e-commerce sales. Look, let's say,
Yeah. I think the main cost drivers here are going to be the size of your EC2 instances and the cost of your RDS. They'll be the 2 big drivers. And both of those things you can scale down pretty small. Most of the other infrastructure, so you might be seeing sort of a lot of complexity, but the reality is that most of this complexity, most of this complex stuff that we're building is either low cost or no cost. So it's pretty, VPCs, flow logs, if your site's very busy, you're going to start potentially paying a little bit more, but if you pay for data transfer out, things like that. But your main sort of drivers of the cost are going to be your actual EC2 bound services like Dynamo, RDS, and EC2. And I mean, at the bare minimum, you could run 1 micro instance for your fleet and 1 micro instance for your admin, and they're going to cost you what, $10-15 a month, something like that each. Off the top of my head, I don't quote me, but they're pretty cheap. So yeah, let's just quickly squeeze through because I can see we're kind of going to run out of time here. So the database stack, pretty straightforward. I'm using burstable type. I've got an option here to say if you've given me a snapshot, I can create it. Sorry, I'm scooting through too quickly. If I get a snapshot, I can create a cluster from that snapshot. So that might be really good if you've got an existing WordPress site and you want to actually bring it into this environment. You can bring in the snapshot and the secrets manager secret, and it will just work. Or alternatively, we create a new database, which is what I've done today. I'm also just a quick call out around CFN NAG. I'm using CFN NAG just to keep me honest. So it makes you specifically explain why you don't want to do some of the things that it thinks are the best practice. Things like changing the default port on MySQL. I could do that. I just didn't. But it's picking me up on things like that. So that's the database stack. It's pretty straightforward. It creates the Aurora cluster. And again, you can control, how many nodes you want, etc., and what instance types you want to pay for there. The admin stack. So this is where the file system gets created. So you can see I've got a whole other slide about EFS, which I will try and get to because I'm just conscious of time. But EFS is an interesting topic all of its own, and maybe if you've got an EFS question, let's park that for the moment until I get onto the slides for that. This is where I'm importing that secret. I'm pulling the secret in from the previous stack. What have we got here? I've got some instance role. So this is the one that allows me to have a read and write access as well as root access to the file system. So I need root access because I'm going to be doing some installation in my user data. So bear in mind that I've got a base image that's already got some stuff configured, and I'll just scoot through to my. So here's my user data being defined. So I've got a command that I'm going to pass through in my user data to get the secret. So that gets my database secret. in a JSON format that I can then use to configure WordPress. I've got my parts up here that are basically mounting the file system. So you can see I'm using the IAM option here when I do the mount. And what that's doing is saying use IAM authentication when I mount the file system, which lets me control the permissions at that granular level in the instance profile. Now I've got a big bash script that's basically doing a conditional, either it'll install WordPress or it won't, depending on whether the FS already has WordPress installed on it. And if it doesn't have it in, it's going to do all this stuff here, which is essentially just configuring the wp-config file. And then we're doing, whoops, sorry about that. And then we're just doing a bunch of stuff, setting permissions as per the best practice guidance on the files that have been created, removing the config sample file, etc. Then I'm going to create the load balancer, create certificates for the load balancer, create the Route 53 hosted zone, and create the auto-scaling group. So the auto-scaling group, by default, if you create an auto-scaling group, I was admonished by a colleague for letting it do its default thing, which is use a launch configuration. It'll create a launch configuration for you. If you want a launch template instead, because they're the modern preferred way of doing things now, you need to actually specifically create it in your auto-scaling group. So thanks, Tiago, for nagging me about that. You can set your min-max capacity. You can see I've set them here to 1, which is apropos of that conversation we were having before. So you want to be able to, you only need 1 of these because it's not going to get much traffic in this scenario. That's about it for that one. And then the main difference with the fleet stack is that the fleet stack is very similar. It's got lots of the same stuff, much smaller user data script because all it has to actually do is mount the directory. It's not doing any installation. And it has only client mount permissions on the IAM policy. So that's the difference there. So it doesn't have any need to install anything, so it doesn't need root access. And as mentioned before, the whole purpose of this is that it's a read-only file system. And then finally, we've got our CDN stack. So that's pulling in the previous. It's pulling in the ALB DNS name and the things like the site host name, etc. It's creating the WAF. So I've got a thing commented out here. Sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit. I'm probably making everyone seasick. So it's got I can create an IP set, like a permitted IP, so like an allow list. I've just commented that out because I don't need it. But then I've also got my managed WordPress rule set that I've got that set up, and then I'm just adding a couple of IP reputation, bad known inputs, etc. And then there's a lot of stuff around how to configure CloudFront. So this is kind of quite a specific thing for WordPress. There's some specific things you need to allow through CloudFront to the origin in order for WordPress to work correctly. If you don't pass these things in, it doesn't work. So, and then there's an origin request policy here. There's a cache policy. Again, you want to make sure that you pass through query string parameters to your cache keys. But you can see I've removed the other things so that it will cache more effectively. And then we've got a CloudFront function. So what this does is it just runs this little tiny snippet of code. And what it does is it actually pulls the IP address of the requester and puts it into this header. And that's used then by the ALB in the rules. So the rules in the ALB will look at this true client IP and it'll determine whether to pass the request through to the admin fleet, or the the admin autoscaling group, or to the fleet one.
Yep.
And then
that's a good use for a cloud function, because like just yesterday I was talking about specific pieces of cloud native security that we have in place. So they were a little traditional, and they used like some of the more traditional like firewall products that are out there, and doing things like header manipulation at like their load balancer product that they were doing. And so what about if I wanted to manipulate a header? Like, what's a cloud native mechanism for going ahead and doing that? And the answer would be exactly this. You need to manipulate something in a header, or a light touch piece of manipulation to the incoming request. CloudFront functions will do it. The difference between a CloudFront function and Lambda at edge is that the CloudFront function will run at the point of presence. Lambda at edge will run within the region that you deploy into.
The other thing too is that CloudFront functions are only on the viewer side; they're not on the origin side. So Lambda functions, you can do viewer request and also origin request, and origin response and viewer response. You can have Lambda at edge functions on all 4 points, whereas CloudFront functions only have viewer request and viewer response. But super useful, super lightweight, definitely the way to go if you're doing header manipulation. So here's our CloudFront distribution, and you can see we've then also, I'm building another behavior for our uncached paths. So there's some paths here, again, WordPress specific, that we don't want to cache. So I've just built and again, nice thing about using CDK and using Python is I can create this array of things, and then rather than, with Cloud, I can just go into a loop and create them.
Rather than copy paste, you can just do it like one time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Then I'm creating some Route 53 records and so forth as well. But what I might do now, so that's sort of the CDK project, and I know we've sort of done a really quick whiz through it, and hopefully it's been understandable. But I'm just again conscious of the time, so if we could maybe switch back to the slides. I just wanted to touch on finally a couple of things around EFS. So one of the golden rules, I think, with WordPress, and it's to a large degree with web, in general, is you do want to think about caching all the way down. So with WordPress, it's especially important, and because we're using EFS as the file system, we don't want to hit EFS harder than we need to. And so how do we actually make that, make the use of EFS as light as possible? So obviously we've got caching in the browser, so we want to make sure we've got our caching headers correct. We've got caching in the CDN, so you can see from the CDK project, there's a lot of configuration there on what to cache, how to cache it, which paths you can cache, which paths we shouldn't. Apache, so we've got caching configured in Apache too, which we haven't looked at, but there's a caching capability in Apache, so I'm using that as well. Plugins can be installed in WordPress that will do caching as well. They'll cache pages that have been generated for a period of time. And then finally, right at the code layer, we mentioned PHP 5 earlier. PHP 5 had the option to have opcache. PHP 7.4 has opcache built in and enabled by default. So what opcache does is it caches the like the parsed or the executed binary PHP for a period of time. So it means that the number of times that the web server has to go off and fetch the PHP code and execute it is cut down. So opcache really removes a lot of that that busyness that otherwise would be happening as well. So again, like security, it's a multi-layered strategy. You want to make sure you're caching the right things at every level to minimize to optimize performance and also minimize load. But finally, I just wanted to touch on some of the EFS performance enhancements that have happened since. So I initially did a version of this in 2019 and wrote a blog post about it. The advice back then was just be careful about EFS, because EFS, performance issues can be a problem. a lot of the things that were a concern back then and are now no longer a concern. Amazing performance improvements have been added. You can see there read operations 400% improvement back in April 2020. 500 megabytes it'll be per second per client throughput. The bursting, so EFS, like EBS, it's got this concept of burst credits. So a burst credit, and like T series instances, it's got this concept of that over time you build up a bank of credits. So while you're not using CPU, in the case of T instances, and while you're not using file IO on EFS, while you're not using it, you build up a bank of credits that you can then exhaust during periods of busy activity. So you've got a baseline performance, and then you've got your burst performance. And so one of the traps you can get to with using EFS is you exhaust your burst credits. And if you exhaust your burst credits, you're in a world of pain because all of a sudden your throughput, turns into this. So there's been a lot of improvements around how you can do that now. You can have provisioned throughput as well, so you can pay for a guaranteed amount. Because one of the chief issues of using EFS with websites is that EFS was designed to scale its throughput capability and its burst credit earning capacity based on the amount of data you had in it. So if you had a terabyte of data, or you would generate burst credits, a lot more than if you had like 10 megs of data. And obviously a website typically would only have a relatively small amount of data. So there was all sorts of tricks you had to go through. You have to ballast your EFS by putting big empty files on it to make it generate burst credits more quickly. So you don't have to do any of that anymore. You can just have provisioned throughput. And all of these improvements that have happened, including things like the average latency as low as 600 microseconds. That's phenomenal, I think, for a network attached storage that's shared across multiple instances. To have that sort of latency number is pretty incredible, I think. So yeah, lots of improvements have happened to EFS that make this sort of architecture, I think, a lot more achievable and a lot more attractive than it was back on the bleeding edge in 2019. So burst credits, just be aware of them. You need to make sure you've got a monitor for them, even though there's a lot more capability to design around it and to have solutions sort of baked in. You do need to monitor them, and that's it. So there's that URL there to have a look through at throughput modes.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much for that, Guy. Do you think that any of this code we're going to get up somewhere on GitHub where people like our audience will be able to look at at some point in time? And if it's not there today, that's fine. We can add it to the archive later.
Yeah. Look, I'd really love to share it. I think it's probably a good, useful baseline for a bunch of different things. Doesn't have to be WordPress.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think so too. So awesome. Well,
thank you
so
very much. That was awesome.
Right?
Yeah,
it was great, and it's even with WordPress, when you want to build it, and that's why I sort of said earlier, productionizing is very different to proof of concept. You have to consider what you're doing. This looks like something that you would consider productionizing. Has the mechanisms to like block access, setting up the right methods for like caching. At the end of the day, deploying an application like this is going to be like really well optimized and really tailored towards something that you can feel, hand on heart that like that's going to go out there and perform really, really well in the real world.
So just to polish that off, Paul, like after seeing all of this, are we going to have to migrate our blog to this design versus Lightsail?
We might have to. Yeah,
we might have to.
Very cool.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Well, thank you very much, Guy. We'd love to have you back on some other time and potentially do that migration. We've got to go. Cool. We've all got to jump. So we'll catch up with you separately offline later. But that was fantastic, and I hope the audience all has a awesome day, nighttime, morning, whatever it is your time zone. Thanks
for coming to watch.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks for having me. Bye.